All right, got my man Dale Baker. We're talking about playing with multiple percussionists, okay, multiple drummers, right? So I mostly play stuff that's not a conventional drum set, although there's times like in a worship set where I'm asked to do that, or like I've got a jazz gig coming up and I am going to actually be playing drum set, but I'm going to be playing as a hybrid drum set, right? And Dale, I believe your primary thing, even though you've played multiple percussion, is playing from a drum set perspective. But you tend to bring your background with, like, I have a conga drum next to me. You tend to bring your background with that exposure into that platform, right?
Yeah.
So we both have kind of like this thing in common where we like all different types of percussion and we like textures, but we come from a different maybe principle, kind of role or responsibility. So recently, I was in your studio. Right now, you're in a very comfortable looking setting. You're not in your
Oh
music
yeah.
studio,
All
but
right.
but you were in your music studio, which is very cool. It's got its nice vibes, and we were with Claybrook, who is a singer songwriter, a very folksy, uh, James Taylor tradition type of coming out of that tradition. He has his own sound, but more laid back type of that vibe. And so it's a little bit of attention, but then it kind of comes back a little bit back and forth. A lot of acoustic guitar driven. So in that setting, you and I were playing here recently, and we're actually in the process of making some live versions of Clay's songs. So when I was up there, one of the things that I noticed for me bringing like congas and bongos and other percussion, smaller instruments, is that instead of you intentional right off the bat going to the snare and the hi-hat, this thing right here, you went right to the right and then just grabbed some dem sticks, which are like brushes, and went
Yeah.
to the floor tom and the side and a ride cymbal, which I thought was really cool. I have other friends that do similar things, but it's kind of unconventional. Why did you decide, instead of going straight to the snare, how did you come about deciding to do that while we were playing these actual pop songs?
Right.
Like, maybe you can just kind of talk about like your
Yeah.
your your decision in that singer songwriter decision to not even use the snare drum right away. What was that all about?
Yeah. I think what's happening without me actually thinking about it is that I'm listening to whatever the singer songwriter's bringing. Like, so he's key, and what's the melody doing? What's how is he playing guitar? And just there's something about how Claybrook plays that I just immediately go, oh, this is like a bossa nova, or this is not American. This is something else, and I don't know exactly what that something else is, but it's not going to be a conventional drum beat.
Right.
Um, and so that's kind of where my head goes already. And so, like his earlier records were all just like low key bossa nova type
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
songs
70s, 60s, 70s. Yeah.
on the drum set. Yeah, so I was doing stuff on the drum set because that's where I was feeling it. But since then, he's released a bunch of different music, and so the yeah, and I think on any song that you pull up from his, it's not going to sound like a conventional drum set part. And some of that stuff I've played on, other stuff he's produced with someone else, and so I like that. I don't know what it is in me, but I think I know that it's it comes from having played percussion and having respected the parts that each. I kind of came up playing congas and took lessons with Frankie Malabé, and there's a whole group of us at school that were. I was sort of learning from them as they were learning the Latin rhythms for salsa and all the different styles. And so I initially started playing congas, and so uh, and then that branched out into a bunch of other percussion stuff. But so I think I think about music in layers, and so if there's already a rhythm being established, then how do I respond to that?
Okay.
And so what was happening with that Claybrook session is that he was already playing. You jumped in, I think, and then I'm like, well, I what else is there to add? And the only thing I could think of is like it just needs like some sort of eighth note steadiness to just kind of glue it all together. And I wasn't conscious about it, but I love those dim sticks in that they don't feel very specific to a genre. They just
Okay.
they're evocative of stuff, and I think that's how the percussion world has worked itself out in me is that I'm not so much a literalist. I'm just I like the ideas that they evoke. And so, in that particular instance, I was kind of almost doing a Weiro um,
Yeah.
vibe, but I was just playing it on the side of the drum. So it's like, well, what are you doing? Is that a timbali rhythm that you're doing, or is it a
Yeah.
Weiro thing? Like, make up your mind, dude. And I was like, I don't know. It just sounds good right now, so I'm going to go with that. But then the analytical side of me is like trying to make it fit with. Oh, but this is still legitimate because it's a rhythm that you would find in Latin music or whatever. And it's like it doesn't matter. We're just trying to play music, right?
Right. We're creating something.
And that's what I love about um, you take all your experiences and all your influences, and then you try to forget that you have any of that. And then you just try to respond to the moment that's presenting itself to you.
Mm.
And then interesting stuff comes out, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what I find is interesting is so, like you said, you talking about the Guido, and you were playing on the side of the floor tom with the dem sticks, and that's like the cascara of a timbales, right? But
Right.
if we were to think about it, maybe analytically, that has a certain a frequency range where it is a lot like a hi hat, and if you go into the genre of like merengue or mambo or salsa, then those, whether it's the guido or the cascara, the shell of the timbales, it carries the same role and responsibility where in rock the hi-hat would, where it's like an ostinato, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas
Yeah. Hmm.
all of that is a similar role and it's a frequency range, right?
Yeah.
And so what I find interesting is then I wonder if the possibility is when you heard the song, then you heard, okay, Claybrook is playing and he's picking every now and then. I already hear the frequency range of a snare. Do I need to play the snare drum for what the snare drum usually brings? So the snare drum usually it provides this pop, this drive, this punctuation.
Yeah.
It's a backbeat, like pow, right? Or
Right.
ding, whatever it's tuned to. So if I'm going to play that on, I can use that with accents. So like you were going, you were playing accents in there. So that, or maybe me playing on the congas, maybe you heard that backbeat and was like, okay, there's already enough that's
Yeah.
already accented.
You were doing the snare drum part with what you were playing. So like I didn't need to worry about that. And then the only thing that I thought was missing was maybe some low end information. But the congas had some of that. So I thought, okay, I'll do the floor tom to get some of that low end information. But
Right, right.
even as I was playing that, I realized you and I were going for the same fills and the same rhythms.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
um, so that made me rethink, well, what do I do on the floor tom so that I don't get in the way of William?
Mm.
Um, and uh, and so of everything I'm doing right now, what's most important? I think it's the side thing. And then if I can catch any low end stuff that doesn't mask what you're doing, then
Yeah.
we're on the right track.
When you say what will be the most important, I wonder then, are you thinking what is, if I took anything out, what am I bring, what's helping drive right now this song or fill the space? What's helping fill the space? Because there was only three of us, right?
Yeah.
So like you're talking about the low end, if there's only three of us and he's on an acoustic guitar, there's no bass, but we
Mhm.
might want bass. So then it
Right.
comes down to decisions, right? So you're making your own decision and you decided, hey, I don't think there's a need to have an actual snare drum right now. Now, if we listen back later on, we might go, hey, let's add that.
Hmm.
Or, but so I like the idea, like what we're talking about in the underlying concept, I think often comes back to when you're playing with another percussionist, it comes to your subjective decisions that you're making in the moment. We're,
Hmm.
we're all creating this painting, right? And we have this canvas and we're deciding what colors do we want to use. What kind of painting is it? Is it abstract? Is it surrealism? Is it going to be red? Is it going to be green? What kind of painting? And once we make that decision and we are able to just be committed to a decision, now we can kind of move forward from there. And later on, and later on, it's malleable. We can decide, we like it or we don't like it. We choose something else later,
Yeah.
right? So, and I think for me, what the biggest part of there's two things when it comes to playing with a drummer, like a drum set or a drum set player playing with a percussionist. One, it's knowing enough about your instrument as far as what why you're playing and what you're playing. So like you mentioned, we were going for the same rhythms. And essentially we were playing like almost like a tumbao slash bossa nova. Boom boom
Yeah.
bak
Yeah.
boom bak boom. So there was an underlying clave that we were both going for, right?
Hmm.
And if you understand that, if I understand that as a percussionist, then I can decide, okay, he's already playing that. So I
Hmm.
can choose a place. So number one is understanding that, and then two, understanding the roles of what each instrument brings frequency wise. Like you
Yeah.
mentioned, they're already playing the snare. He's already playing that tone. So I think if we understand roles and responsibility, we understand frequency range, we're more equipped with tools and what we decide to pick up. And then the
Yeah.
third element is knowing ourselves, right? Our
Yeah.
voice and character. Do I have to? So for me, it's always been helping people to be unlocked from this uh, purist, like I have to be on the hi hat and snare, or I have to be on the congas, or I have to have this type of sound. Maybe, maybe
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, and it's okay either way because it might be like if that's your instrument and you love to play that, then that's fine. But if you're trying to actually break out and be more creative and play all these other things, then it's like maybe, well, maybe we don't have to actually play that. And you, what's interesting to me is there's so many hit songs where you hear a snare part, but it wasn't actually a snare drum.
Right.
So which leads me to a question: have you ever been in the studio? Because you played like back in the day. Your first big band you played with was Sixpence None the Richer, right?
Yeah.
Unless
Yeah.
you play. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I
But
mean, that's yeah. Yeah.
and then you started playing with all these other bands. Was there any time in the studio where you guys were creating these songs that we'd listen to later, where it was a snare part but it wasn't an actual snare drum?
Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of way I think is, and part of it is my training as a percussionist. But then I think even prior to that, I grew up in the age of drum machines and just layering parts, right?
Yeah.
And so, so I think I might have gone to a clinic or something in a studio at one point, and the my professor that was with me or somebody there said, it sounds really great if you just do 16ths a shaker on top of an eighth note hat. And I'm like, wait a second, that's not all happening by the drummer. No, no, there's a thing called overdubbing. It's like, so
Yeah.
then once I realized, oh, you can overdub stuff, then it became a thing of like, what am I really hearing on those songs that I love? And then you could hear like, oh, there's a kabasa doing little extra accents. And so that's not the guy playing hi-hat. He's actually just playing a straight beat. So you start hearing all these layers um and so then and so that made me think of like, oh, so it doesn't actually have to be a snare drum. It just has to play the role of the snare drum.
The,
And so that's, and I think for folk music in particular, like what Claybrick does and other singer songwriters I play with, if you play the typical drum set beat, it obliterates any of the feeling. It has the possibility of obliterating anything that the singer songwriter is trying to communicate,
okay.
because you as a listener just goes, "Oh yeah, that's the drum beat that you play with every rock song." So I'm listening to a rock song now. No, you're not listening to a rock song. This is somebody trying to pour his heart out to you. He's trying to tell a story. So it's like I would ruin the gig if I just did the conventional beat, um, I think in the back in the day, it would be like, what drum beat do I need to play? What rules do I need to follow? And now I'm kind of at a place, and I think you're probably there too, where it's like, you know what? I'm gonna not play anything because the song is so good as it is. So is there anything I can add? If there's not, then I'm sitting this one out. And that's kind of the way I felt the other day. It's like I think it sounds great without me. So if I'm gonna do one thing at all, and based on what you're talking about, I think what I did is without realizing it, I went to timbali mode. So if you're going to be conga bongo dude, then I'm going to go on the timbales. But I didn't have a timbali, and I would never have thought that I was playing timbali. But that rhythm that I was playing on the side of the drum, yeah, that's the timbali rhythm. And then I'd occasionally hit an open sound on the floor tom, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's kind of like what a timbali player does when he's just keeping time. And then
And I think if I might be wrong. I'd have to go back and listen, but
yeah.
I think you landed on the four on the floor tom multiple times.
Right, or it was like either the 4 or the and a 4, which is exactly like right where you do the tumbao, right?
Exactly.
Eh,
It's because and for the bass note, we're going to lean on the four, right?
yeah, yeah.
And every now and then, obviously, we were on the one because we're going to do that. But the in that kind of music, the one is sometimes a suggestion. We all know where it's at, so we don't have to hinge on that. We hinge on a four, which interestingly, in old school and Motown music, it was a similar thing with the crash and everything. Instead
Mhm.
of crashing and bringing everything on one, it might be four, three, God, boom, 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 bot, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But those worlds were often connected anyway.
And that I think also the other thing to think about is that I'm always thinking about the narrative arc of a song. You know, like every song, everything you do is a composition, and so whether it's a play, it's a story, whatever, we're all just creating a composition. And does this thing have a narrative arc? Does it surprise me? Do I think I know where the story's going to go? Okay, great. What can I surprise myself? And so what happens is like, okay, we get a groove kind of established. Okay, this sounds good. Okay, now I know exactly what's going to happen. That bugs me. That bothers me that it's just going to be a cliche rhythm throughout. So then I'm always thinking, well, how can I stoke the fire a little bit by doing something that how can I just jack with the idea that we're doing, you know? And so even though we were kind of doing this Latin rhythm thing, then I felt like it was my response. I kind of knew where you were going to go. So, and I know that Claybrooks, he's going to play whatever he's going to play. So, is there something I can do that screws everything up in the best possible way to keep drawing you in to listen to the song without becoming like stealing the focus, you know? And so I think that's there was like some fills or things that I did where it's like, oh, those wouldn't be traditional Latin fills, I don't think, but and I'm not like conscious of it. I'm not necessarily conscious of the fact that I'm playing a Latin rhythm or hitting on the one. It's just what can I do to spice this thing up a little bit, you know? And and I think a lot of that, you know, the jazz training and the Latin training, and then also being a big fan of the Police and how Stuart Copeland plays, like there's always this sort of instigator making things go forward, you know, and it's either in the improvisational parts of playing jazz together or in Latin music where there's somebody's doing something that um, creates more excitement or more tension, and I love that. I love that thought that there's a conversation going on. It's not like, oh, we're just playing a rhythm, but there's communication happening in real time together in that moment, and all you have is that moment. The next time we do it, it's going to be a completely different moment. But just getting to a place where it's like, oh, I'm so glad that I've studied as much as I have, and there's plenty more to study. But right now, I only have these tools at my disposal. So, what does this moment need? And can I be right here and not think, oh, I can't wait till we get to the chorus because I got a freaking cool beat I'm gonna do. Like it's like, no, I don't know what I'm gonna play until I play it, you know.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Man, that's good. And you mentioned Stuart Copeland. And now I could go on a whole rabbit trail, diatribe with Stuart Copeland. I just think he's one of the most fascinating musicians for me. I wish there needs to be constantly more interviews and like documentaries with his stuff. It's
Yeah.
fascinating. And I encourage a lot of percussionists to look into his stuff because now he's done quite well with the film and scoring as well. So,
Yeah.
and that's encouraging as a percussionist too, right? Because there's so much that's happening. You are real big on one of the things that I noted that I gleaned from you that I like and I picked up right away. And even when I first met you and saw your set, was was the textures of the drums, right? You don't necessarily, and I'm not against stuffing the drums with stuff
Um,
and making the sound a certain way because at the end of the day, it's about what's needed at that moment. But you're real big on the tones. Like I can hear independent, lots of tones of wherever the drum is speaking, and
hmm.
you're using it almost like a piano, right? So you and I both have this admiration for vintage drums. I think a lot of people do now because that's the season of life that we're in. It's a trendy thing. Uh, but I love when each in drums have their own characteristic voice, and then you can use that as a texture. I think that's sometimes probably why you pick up like broomsticks and dem sticks. You're looking for all of these different
Yeah.
sounds.
Yeah.
You mentioned something one time about not being as good as you need to be or as intentional as you need to be with tuning your drums. But when I hear you play the drums, they sound incredibly tuned. I'm like, I don't know, that's a pretty masterful way of tuning the drums. What do you mean as, when you're setting your drums up and you're playing with a singer songwriter? What is your approach on as far as you tuning? When you're sitting in a certain room, are you tuning to a certain thing, or do you hear the drum where it's tuned, and then if you like that, do you just say, "Hey, I kind of like where that's at. Let me kind of evolve around that sound." What's kind of your approach to the actual sound and tuning of
Yeah, so back in the day, I'd have like a really nice drum set. It's like maple, it's like great, and I would sit there and make sure everything was in tune and try to maybe get the bottom head at certain distances from the top head, and I would obsess over this stuff, and I'd be like, "Well, that sounds in tune. It's got a nice pure tone, great."
pure tone?
And then I would get into the studio or I'd get at a gig and the sound engineer would be like, "Yeah, man, that thing's ringing too much. Could you do something about that?" And then so I would try, but it would always felt like, Why is he harshing my sound, man? He's not. This is my sound, dude." And then, uh, and then when I got into the studio, I started realizing like my drums sound better if they sound like crap to my ears. Like the more I tried to sound them, make them sound pristine, the
Yeah.
worse they sounded in the studio. So I'm like, I need to just stop thinking about it. And so I've just kind of come across this idea that, and I think I understand it better now with the right mics and all that.
Yeah.
But to my ears, my drums just sound like pitched cardboard. Um, but underneath all that pitched cardboard is just a little bit of tone. And if you get the right mic and the right position, it picks up that tone, but it doesn't kill, it doesn't, I don't know. I think there's just a, I really don't know what it is, but everybody, like when I think my drums sound the worst, like I don't know about this gig, man. I haven't touched my drums in forever. I'm going to just show up and I haven't had a chance to just kind of give them a once over. I'll set up, we'll start playing, and then somebody will turn around and go, "Dude, your drums always sound so amazing." And I'm like, "Really?" Because I haven't done jack to these things in
Wow.
forever, you know? And, but then I hear stories like, I can't think of these studio dudes. But these studio guys out in LA that are like people I look up to that I can't remember their names, but they'll talk about how they never change their drum heads out. They just love that it just gets dirty and crappy, and they don't have any divots, but it's just like that head is not a clean head. And then when I think about, back in the day when you had calfskin heads, I mean, do you change your conga heads for every session? Hell no, right? They age over time and they become like your sound in some magical way, right? And if they break or if they something goes through the head, sure, you'll change them, but they're good, And when I think about the history of drum heads, like they were calf heads. So you would get a calf head and you would keep it on there until something happened to that drum. And so along comes plastic heads, and we're all like, "Oh no, we gotta change them out for every session." And I'm like, that's not how the old school did it, I think. So I just wonder how far I can push this. If it sounds good or if it's got a vibe, then that's my vibe. That's my sound, and that's not a bad thing. If you want me to change the heads outs, I can do that. And I think over time too, I've just gotten to the place where it's like, well, I have a sound. I'm me, and I'm never going to be Kenny Aronoff, and so I don't need to get clean heads on every session. Um, but
Because
yeah,
I can't knock some of that, like the engineering side, and even some. It's different. Sound engineers are different, but sometimes when people will be locked in, you'll be at a concert, and it might be a big concert, and we spend, I don't know, an hour nailing this perfect kick drum sound. You know how it is,
yeah,
and I
yeah,
can't knock it, but then there's times where I'm like, man, I'm not saying I know the most because I don't, but then I'll be like, actually, I've been playing the drums a long time, and I actually like the way that kick sounded before. It was okay, but
yeah,
then out here when they do make changes to it, and I'm like, well, actually, that sounds pretty dope too. That sounds pretty good. So I think a lot of it is subjective, but I just find all of that a very interesting, an interesting world, because it's you're right. It's you can go really deep into the whole world of sound, and like you're talking about coating the head be getting dirty or grimy, that almost becomes like a coated head, or and it made me think of something. I lost my train of thought there, but it just made me think of like your voice, it becoming a certain sound that you have. I know what it was. The balophone from West Africa or
Okay.
from southern part of the continent. And when you think about the balophone versus a pure toned uh, marimba, or the casa, not casa flute, that's a company, but when you think about the fula flute versus from West Africa, which is very breathy and you scream into it and you make all these overtones, and you
Hmm.
think about that versus a traditional classical flute, there's the pure tone, then there's the overtones. The balophone, to me, that's not everybody's thing, but it sounds so cool. But in certain cultures, that little bit of like distortion that's added to it is what they're going for. The guitar is a great example. That's like our version, generally speaking. Um, a lot of our big classic rock hits have distorted guitars on them. We don't always want the pure, clean tone. We add fuzz, we add wah, we add all different types of things to the tone of the guitar that brings character to it, right?
Yeah.
And then there's a time for the pure tone, but that almost becomes like a different genre, right?
Hmm.
Like the
Hmm.
soul, gospel, bluesy thing versus opera, you know?
Yeah.
So, I think it's important to understand and be okay with, who you are and what you're going for, and, just kind of letting go sometimes. That I think what often happens is when people are starting in the drums and the percussion, and then you get a certain type of knowledge, even in the engineering side, once you get to a knowledge, you tend to really go that direction hard.
Hmm. Yeah.
And then as you get a little bit older, you're in it for a little bit longer, then you relax, and the fundamentals was still important, and it allows you to kind of you break the rules, you learn the rules first, and then you know how to break them, right?
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
that sort of thing, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. And I think too, like there's something about having done having studied percussion, and also being a fan of like, Smithsonian folkways music, and like um, capturing the sound of the South in the 1930s, or we're going to go up to the mountains and there's Joe Bob playing banjo, and it's like nobody goes, "Hey Joe Bob, like your banjo sucks. Let's retune that." It's like here's his thing. Let's just capture it because this is really unique, and so I think there's something about that to me of like um, I don't necessarily. I want to be flexible enough to do what people want me to do. I want to serve the situation. But what I found is that making peace with like the sound that you have, the sound of your drums, whatever it is that's happening, you don't have to understand it, but people seem to like it. So the less you touch it, and the less you try to make it perfect, the better it's going to work. And that doesn't mean that I'll tune, to a session, I think a lot of times it's parts related. So it's like, oh, I'm going to play a tom there. Does that tom need to have a tone, or is it fine just being like more attack and kind of going like where does it sit? Where does the drum set sit in the frequency range? And I think for me, I think drums should just be at the lowest frequency below the band, and maybe bass guitar is like right above the kick. So if I can make everything on my drums as dead as possible, then I'll take the ocean floor, and then you can stack all the instrumentation on top of that. But if my tom is all of a sudden up in where the guitar range is, it's like, well, that might be a cool part, but you've got to suss that out with the guitar player because you don't want to be playing on his note, which I think all of that comes from having had a little bit of a background in percussion, where it's like there everything fits together in a really unique way, and everyone knows what everyone else is doing, and so that tom might be the thing to play, but the guitar player is going to have to know that, oh, you're going to do that in that spot, and that's going to be a moment in the song, possibly. But
Yeah, and you
yeah.
said something that kind of leans us towards, like, we've been talking about playing different types of percussion from around the world, different genres from around the world, in a lot of different regions of the world, including within the United States, depending upon the genre. it's more normal to play with multiple percussionists than it is to be the only percussionist, right?
Yeah.
Depending on your genre, that's just what's in there. And so I think it behooves someone, if they're trying to learn and get better at that, is to allow them to listen to these different styles like rumba from Cuba, where you have multiple people playing, or Motown, even within the United States, music prior to that 90s grunge moments, where and later on where the percussion started to go to almost nothing, but before that, when you listen to a lot of like Peter Gabriel, Paul Simon, and a lot of other stuff from the 80s and before, there was a lot of percussion in there, and that was very normal, you
Yeah.
know. But yeah, I think being exposed to that actually helps. And at first, it could seem like if someone's going the classical route, like a classical meaning like class, like in a university, it could almost seem like, well, I play the drum set, I play this pop style of music, and I'm not gonna play Brazilian music. But the idea is that, like, if you and I are playing in a church setting, okay, or we're playing in a secular setting where it's contemporary pop, we might not be playing that style of music, right? But the if we're playing in an acoustic setting, there's often no we're like having to be composers. You're
Hmm.
literally composing music. So
Right.
you're coming up with percussion parts. So I think that is where it benefits and behooves someone to study Brazilian stuff, to study Cuban stuff. It's not that the culture or the people group is better, but that they take those instruments seriously, so they're elevating it to a higher level. They're actually getting intricate and becoming technicians. So, unfortunately, what happens, I think, in some areas where, and without this, at the risk of this sounding woke or sounding liberal, because it's not, it's people politicize everything. But I think sometimes what happens is when people look at, let's say, a slum in Brazil, or a poor area in West Africa or in Puerto Rico, and they're seeing these people playing these instruments, you can think, oh, well, there's not a high level of, musicianship. When in reality, they're taking, even if it is an area, let's say in Brazil or somewhere, because some of these areas are very prosperous financially, um, they're taking a very high level sound wise, and they're tweaking what they have, the tools that they have, to sound a certain way. So that's very complex and very intricate. So
Yeah.
they're taking this thing that is rudimentary on an eye level, it only has one single membrane,
Hmm.
but they're taking that and they're getting all of these fine motor movements and different sounds. So they're really bringing it to a very complex level, you know?
Yeah.
And that's not even getting into the whole tabla or bata thing, where you actually do have multiple like skinheads on one drum and
Hmm.
you're tuning it to a definite pitch. That's a whole nother level of
Well, yeah. I mean, I would add to that, like, I really enjoyed my journey into the world of percussion, and I could have learned way more. And I'm just, a beginner in that world. But it was nice to get exposed to a lot of it. But one of the first things I remember learning is the tumbao on the conga, and it was like, cool. Now I know one beat on the conga, and my friend Leanne, she was like, and this other guy Tony Cherubino, big shout out to them. They said, hey, take that tumbao and shift it over an eighth note, and shift it over another eighth note, and shift it over another eighth note. And so then you end up with all these patterns that are essentially the same pattern, but the open sounds are now in different spots. And then if you are playing with a drum set player that's doing the backbeat on 2 and 4, now your slap isn't on top of his backbeat. It's before or after it, or you flip the thing around. And so now it's like I kind of call it rhythmic modulation. Well, it's not modulation, but it's like you're displacing it and you end up with a new beat. And so it would be great if everyone would go out and learn world music and get in that. But even with like a basic beat, I try to tell my students, like, you have everything you need right there. Like if you take 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and just start shifting the bass drum pattern over, or the snare pattern over, or the whole thing over, and you still keep the context that you're in, it's mind blowing what you can come up with. And it's still the same beat. It's the easiest beat in the world. but you haven't had to come up with anything like flashy. It's all just happening rhythmically. And I think that's the thing that world music and Latin music and percussion did for me, was that there's all these rhythms happening in places that I would never have thought were possible.
You're
And
increasing
so,
your vocabulary.
right, right. And so, without having to go into learning a whole nother culture, you could just take the culture you're in currently and just shift things around.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, if we're not keeping solid time and we're not connecting to the rhythm of the song,
Right.
um, then we're kind of just like, what's the point? And
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, that's what I. So for me, it's kind of like when I was an aircraft mechanic, and and you get to a problem, right? And you're troubleshooting. You need to learn the basics and the fundamentals, so that if you get into a new problem, you're not constantly like, well, what do I do about this now? Okay,
Mhm.
boss. Well, what about this? It's like, okay, look. At some point, you have to take the fundamentals, and you have to be able to come up with your own solutions.
Yeah.
And so, music is a similar thing. We're using a you're when like you were talking about time and you were talking about rhythmic displacement, so you have the ability, the fundamental ability to count. So you learn to be able to count, and then you understand that note values, how long or short this rhythm is, if it's a quarter note or eighth notes live within a quarter note. You can count those subdivisions. If you have that tool, now you can take this rhythm from this part of the world and you can manipulate it as a as not a
Mhm.
toothbrush, as a paintbrush, however you want to do,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so for me, and that's always a thing. That's always like when I have students, I'll tell them, okay, I'm gonna teach you if it's hand drums or if we're doing this and that. If this is a Cuban instrument, I'm going to teach you from a Cuban standpoint, but not because Cuba's better. It's because in that part of the world, they took that instrument seriously and rose it to a certain level.
Yeah.
And so they came up with all this vocabulary. So we
Mhm.
can use the vocabulary as a tool. And
Yeah.
that's the same thing with just about anything in the world. So there's one side of the cultural appreciation, and then there's what's technically happening as well. But as a percussionist, one of the best ways to play with another drummer is number one is understanding. As a drummer, we're talking about roles and responsibilities. Can you count, first of all? Can
Mhm.
you tap your foot and count? Do you know where one, two, three, four, five, one and two and? Do you know where the 16th notes are, the dotted notes? If you understand that, anytime you get a new rhythm, you're able to kind of manipulate it the way you want,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
break it up and to make new rhythms out of it because you have a foundation that you're going
Yeah.
going from, you know. So, but which can get into a lot of other things on learning how to learn, and you know, a lot of times when we learn something, there's different levels, right? Some people learn and they stop at the point of they can do it, but you
Yeah.
always want to get to the point where you can't get it wrong, right? Now I know I have it, as
Mhm.
opposed I can do it a couple times, and
Yeah.
that's usually to me what happens when someone says I have a hard time playing this new rhythm, this new beat, a new percussionist. It's like, well, you learn how to do what you can do enough so that you can do it a few
Yeah.
times,
Yeah. Yeah.
but you got to do it so that you can like walk and chew gum at the same time, type of thing,
Right. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And yeah, I love the fact that I mean, I kind of was this way from the get go. Like the first drum beat I ever learned, I probably played it for an entire year with the same album over and over again, because I was like, I can play a beat, and it feels so good to play a beat. And what I've noticed in my playing, over the years, is like I think I'm fine not being able to play everything. I think I like having a sense of what's possible, and then trying to evoke that feeling, but not literally doing that. You know, so it's like, oh, cool. That sounds like you're about to do a tune bow. Well, it's not. I'm just kind of tipping my hat just barely to that, but I'm kind of taking a little bit from here, a little bit from there, and I think that's kind of you know the jambalaya thing that I'm trying to do, is just like, oh, cool, I like this, I like that, and then I also have feeling. I think I'm always trying to figure out, how do I evoke a feeling or a sense of something, a visceral thing, and so I've never really been a technician as much as I've been more of a feeler, and then as I've wanted to make a living out of being a musician, then it's like, well, there's a way to feel and also still be a technician,
Yeah, I think
and
that that part right there is really tough,
yeah.
as far as being a sideman too.
Hmm.
But at the same time, if you're hired to play with someone, they are a musician and they might want a certain thing. And so you're like stuck in these two worlds. But then a lot of times, as you get older, you find out, well, I don't have to have everyone as my client either. You know what I mean? I don't have
Well,
to
there
have
is that, and
everybody.
yeah, and even like I've found, it's when like playing a train beat for a country song or for a songwriter, they'll be, oh yeah, it's just it's that country beat thing, the train beat.
Yeah.
Um, I don't hear a train beat like a train beat. I hear it as like some sort of a samba thing. So it's always
Oh.
evocative of another genre. And so I'm sitting there going, I'm playing a fake samba right now, but it sounds really cool. The
Yeah.
songwriter doesn't know I'm thinking of a different genre. They're just like, well,
Yeah.
nobody plays the train beat like you do, and it's like, thank you. I'm not even thinking about country music right now, and that's also what that does is it populates my head with ideas. So I'm not thinking, in order for this to be interesting to me, I need to play some cool fill, or I need to do paradiddles on the accents or whatever. I'm thinking, what would South America with a guy from Tennessee, what would that sound like together? And I know that I'm not even barely scratching the surface of what that would be, but I get excited about the possibility in my brain and trying to replicate that. Um, so
Wow. So it always comes back to that old ancient, it's always coming back to old ancient wisdom, right? It's just like you just got to listen to other stuff at the end of the day. And I think like if we were talking about going, I had this theme going on with like in the four walls of a sacred house of worship or what have you, a church, and you're playing in contemporary Christian music or worship style as they call it now. What happens a lot of times if you get a 16-year-old who's starting the drums or a 20-year-old or even if you're older but that's the most of the music you hear, well it would make sense that now when you're doing an acoustic vibe or you got to play with this other percussionist that it would be foreign to you because in that world it's generalized or industrialized that it doesn't have that. So you just got to
mhm.
listen to other styles of music that is completely different that has that so you can kind of help bring it into your world,
Yeah,
so that it helps you to compose and arrange. Because at the end of the day, when you are composing, you're bringing from different sources, right? And if
yeah.
the only source you have is in that one box and that thing doesn't exist inside that box, then you just don't have a tool for the job, you know? So it's ancient. You just kind of got to get out of the box, right? It always just kind of comes back to
Yeah, and I think reminding yourself that it's a conversation, it's a language, right? And so you can
that.
learn you by listening to other genres and other music, you can get a sense of what the language of music represents and how conversations happen. And then I think that's the thing that I realized I'm passionate about is honoring the conversation we're having as musicians, and not going, oh no, I've got this great thought, I can't wait until you shut up so I can just spout my wisdom on you. And I think you can hear that. I remember years ago there was I'd played in a lot of black gospel churches just because of random reasons, and that's a different style of music, but it's heartfelt and it's real and it's visceral, and I remember that. And then I got to Nashville and I was talking to somebody at a record company, and they're like, "Yeah, we've got this new record company coming out. It's just black gospel music, and we're selling it to black churches, or whatever, because this is a market that's underserved." And you realize that this was all fabricated so that they could sell a product. And you could hear the insincerity, like you could just feel that it was a step down from the real thing. And I think that's what I hope to do with making music, is just, can I honor the thing that's in front of me as best as I can and not feel like I'm above it or below it. I'm just, with the tools that I've got, for whatever reason, where I'm at right now, can I add to this on any level? Can I help by not playing anything? Can I help highlight someone else who's doing it really great? Um, and I just kind of geek out on that. I love that idea that I've got a lot of power here as a drummer to obliterate every frequency range. So if I'm going to play something, is it absolutely necessary? Because I don't want to ruin the cool thing that already exists, in our midst. And I think to tie it all back to where we started, I think that was where I was, when we all played together. It's like, what is going to serve this situation best? And it might mean that I don't play anything. So um, because I really respect what you bring and what Claybrook brings, and either one of you guys, that would be enough. So it's like, well, what can I do? Maybe a little eighth note over here. Is that okay?
Well,
Will that
you
not
could
get in the
bro,
way?
you could
Yeah,
definitely bring a whole
yeah,
lot more, but your
right.
point is poignant. It's
Hmm.
good. It's great. And what I hear is again, it's to that wisdom thing. It's your personality is the number one thing that you want to continue to work on because
Yeah,
life is the gig. Life is in session, and
there you
that
go.
at the end of the day is what informs your playing. And if you can really work on that, yeah, there's technical things, but
Yeah,
how you even arrive to getting to the technical things really hinges on your personality, you know? So it working on that personality, like you mentioned the conversation thing, to me that's a lifelong thing. If I'm speaking to someone, letting them finish their thought, listening to their thought before I go, oh, I got something cool to say too. Just like,
hmm,
well, if I get to it, I get to it. If I don't, I don't. I can hear what they have to say,
yeah,
because I might miss out on something otherwise, you know.
hmm,
So, but that takes a lot of almost like lowering yourself and then elevating what you're hearing in front of
yeah. I also feel like, yeah, what you're saying. It's like I think that the work that I've done on just a heart level, on a personal level, and on spirituality level, and just trying to make sense of my world as a person, and going to therapy and reading books and learning about my family of origin, like all of that stuff has made me more present as a musician. And so that ego part of me that wants to be the coolest drummer in the world or play the hippest lick or whatever, like that's disappeared. And it's like it's disappeared mostly. I mean, it's still in there somewhere, but but like getting to the place where it's like, yeah, you don't have to beat yourself up for not being like William or like Steven. You have a sound, and that sound is people like it. Like, you have friends that like, we love playing with you, Dale. When are you going to believe it? When are you going to believe that you're enough? And it's like, regardless of where you are on the technique road, you are enough just right where you are. And I remember being a young kid and getting chances to play in church before I even knew how to do really anything. And the choir director would be like, "Hey, I just want you to do this one thing that you're really good at, which is just boom, watch my hand, and every time my hand comes down, you do boom, great." And it's like I was enough for that situation. But somewhere, throughout life beats you up, and you go, I'm not enough because I'm not out in LA doing the sessions, or I'm not this guy, I'm not that guy." And it's like, well, yeah, but can you just make peace with who you are and what you're into? And if you want to be those guys, you can chase that road, but obviously you don't. There's something about where you're at on your journey that you're okay with. And uh and uh and I think that's what the settling down of like that feeling I'm not enough has been allowed me to open up more, and to be okay with being vulnerable enough that I don't have to play anything, because I love the music so much, and I love the people I get to play with, and I just think it's an amazing gift that we even get to try to create something together, and so I think that's a big part of it too, making sure that you're taking care of who you are as a person, because that comes out in your playing. If you're trying to be like somebody else, it's going to sound like that. But if you can just settle down and be like, you know what, I don't have to be good, I can just be Joe Bob up in the mountains playing my crappy banjo, and that is going to bring a vibe and something to the session. And yeah, if I'm bummed that I can't add more, then I'll go home and I'll woodshed, but in the moment, I can't change. I've just got to be who I am,
Yeah.
So
Be who you are. Be okay with who you are. Confidence, uh, man, all good stuff. It sounds so. It's so similar to basically sports and athletics, right?
yeah,
I mean, it's at the end of the day, what's going on up here, what's going on in here, is going to affect everything. So you really have to take a look at that. And if you're not okay with what's going on, it's going to stop you from making decisions that would be beneficial for everyone. People are missing out because you don't even believe in who you are,
Hmm.
and I think, which is a whole nother conversation, I think sometimes that's why certain situations you just are probably not going to be for you. I think there's like a sacrifice of becoming like as young as a man or even a woman, and working and understanding you're not going to like every work situation, so you just kind of got to deal with that until you get to your place. But
Yeah.
at the same time, once you get to a certain place, you have to watch putting yourselves in positions where you're not valued, because there is enough places where you are going to be valued. If it's toxic enough that it's affecting you to the point where you can't even do what you are good at and you
Yeah.
can do, then you really have to sometimes make that decision that that's a toxic situation and it's not good for you and you have to move to another situation. There's obviously the balance there, right? If you're 18 years old and you got to understand that work is work, and sometimes when you do go to work you're not going to like it, right? There's that, but I'm not talking about that, just the being confident enough to make a decision. If you
Hmm.
can't even make a decision because you're so afraid, then maybe you have to evaluate. Maybe you've been put in situations where people are putting you in that situation. Maybe it's not good for you.
Yeah. Um, yeah. Yeah. I think you're right. Like, it's music is a team sport, and if I'm not there to make my teammate look better, to give them the pass so that they can make the goal or whatever, or to so that they can run the play that'll make them the star, then I'm thinking about it wrong. Like, and I think that's a really valid point. Is that what we're all shooting for is a team effort, so that we're all better together, uh, better than we could be on our own. And but then also the thing about ambition is, like, man, if you really want to go after something, you're going to have to go through a lot of crap to get to it. um, and all that crap just reinforces whether or not you really want to do this path that you're on or not. And at any point you can jump off that road and try something else. um, but I know you have, and I have, and probably every other musician has endured some just god awful situations. But we're so in love with this idea that we can communicate music or create something new or make something where there wasn't something there before. Like, that's the thing that keeps pulling us along the way. Um, so
Man, cool. But dude, this has been a great conversation. I'm gonna end the recording right here.